Hey, there's Mike Langford. Welcome to the Augmented Advisor podcast, brought to you by Blue Leaf. On this episode of the show, John Prendergast and I are joined by Ivan Barretto, founder and managing director of RIA Compliance Concepts, for an adventurous exploration of some of the key SEC rule changes coming your way in 2023 and how you and your team can best prepare your business for success. Trust me, this is likely the best compliance-related conversation you've ever heard, so grab a beverage and buckle up. You are absolutely going to love it. Now, before we get rolling, please do make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, the YouTubes, or wherever you like to get your podcast jam on. And if you have a question or a suggestion for a topic or a guest for the show, hit us up, swingbyblueleaf.com, shoot us an email at podcast@blueleaf.com, or hit us up on the socials. Blue Leaf John, myself, we're all active on LinkedIn, Twitter, and elsewhere, and we're super easy to find. Okay, are you ready to rock? Let's do this thing. Here comes Ivan Barretto from RIA Compliance Concepts. Well, Ivan Barretto, John Prendergast, so wonderful to see you guys. Welcome to the Augmented Advisor podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Mike? What's up, Ivan?
Yeah,
hey,
this is great,
John,
dude. I'm
hey,
so
Mike,
excited
how
to
are
see you
y'all?
guys. I got to tell you, Ivan, I did not expect you to be so difficult to wrangle to get on this show because I was looking forward to it. And we've done several podcasts together before. And I'm like, I think Ivan's ducking me, but it turns out this is like the busiest time of year for you and your business. So I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you've carved out this hour.
No, this definitely, no, I'm glad to be here. It's great to talk about this topic that we're going to discuss. Yeah, you're right. It is the busiest time of year for us. But, this is a great topic that we really do need to talk about. So I'm looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Well, last podcast, you immediately came to mind. Well, John was, he was on fire during our last podcast. We had Gregg from FlexShares ETFs on as a guest.
One might say ranting.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna, that's your word, not my word. I don't know. Maybe we should add a rant segment to this podcast. That'd be great.
Yeah.
But anyways, Laura Gregg from FlexShares ETFs and her team had just released this annual study of investment management trends. And this year, they had a really strong emphasis on how advisors are embracing outsourcing in their business. And toward the end of the episode, John, in his words, teed up a rant about the SEC's proposed rule changes on how investment advisors can use outsourcing and what they should be doing and so forth, from like due diligence and all that type of stuff. So John found some challenges with the proposed rules, and we discussed them. And I thought, you know who we need to have on the show? Ivan. This is Ivan's life. He helps advisors with their compliance stuff as it relates to these types of things. So we wanted to get you on the show to talk about that. So how do you and the team at RIA Compliance Concepts advise your clients on their use of outsourced solutions? Let's start there, because I'm sure this is like a regular occurrence and you're going through renewals and all that type of stuff, but this stuff is going to make its way into some of their documents. So let's dive right in.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, in the digital world that we live in, most everyone, and this is not a new topic or a new concept or whatnot. People have been outsourcing their stuff for quite some time now, right? Since the invention of the internet. But the reality of it is that as we go into the digital age, there's some risk involved, and that's why this has become a new topic of discussion, or a new proposed rule about due diligence from the SEC, is because a lot of people are outsourcing a lot of their stuff, and there are vendors that are touching, PII or NPI information, and there has to be some kind of due diligence process to vet these vendors out because of the client sensitive information that they've got access to. So with that being said, with anything that you use for your business, you should do some kind of due diligence and research and see if this is the right vendor and the right process. Make sure this vendor doesn't have any cybersecurity issues or ongoing cybersecurity issues and stuff like that. So one of the examples I want to give to you is like the recent people are using password managers right now, right? And so LastPass just recently got put out a notice that they had a data breach, and it's as the news is coming out, it's beginning to look really, really bad for people that use LastPass. So things like that, that's got a lot of client, potential client sensitive information, login information, whatever you use LastPass for. I mean, that's a good example of like this, why the regulators are starting to hone in on a due diligence process for vendors that they're using to run your business, and what information is critical and what they're using the vendors for, right? So I understand where they're coming from. Now, as far as like, getting into the weeds on a lot of, and this is what they typically do. Most of the time, the SEC throws a big, wad of wet tissue paper and see how much of it sticks to the wall. And that's what they do when they propose a rule, and then they leave it open for public comment for 60 days. And then you basically, as a citizen of the general public, an advisor or a compliance professional, accountant, whatever, that this rule may affect you, you have the ability to chime in and say, okay, I don't understand this. These are some of my comments about what you guys are proposing. How is this feasible? Is this really reasonable for what you're asking for people to do for due diligence and stuff like that? Because the reality of it is, you've got big firms like your custodians, your performance reporting software like Blueleaf, and you've got the smaller vendors that are, just consultants and accountants and stuff like that don't have a robust, process, documentation for due diligence and stuff like that. So there has to be kind of and through this process, they're trying to weed out what is reasonable and what's not reasonable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
It does. And that's sort of the key question, I think. It seems to me that one of the likely unintended, but maybe it's intended consequence of this proposed rule change with the SEC is that it kind of flips the industry on its head in terms of due diligence. Meaning it really imposes a high burden on the smallest firms to do all of this diligence work, where traditionally and resource-wise, it's the large firms that are doing all of the diligence, with vendors like Blueleaf, et cetera. And the small firms that do business with, say, Charles Schwab, rely on Charles Schwab to do that diligence. And this really turns that around and makes it the individual advisor's responsibility. So the big question I've got is, what's a reasonable amount of due diligence for a solo advisor, or a small RIA firm to do with their outsourcing providers? That LastPass example is a great question. How does a little advisor diligence LastPass? Like it doesn't seem to be a solution to that. So I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, so one of the things that the regulators, I've talked to regulators in the past, basically have said that, they've left it broad, and they look at the policies and procedures and processes on the size and scope of the firm, right? So, I mean, the best example I can give is like cybersecurity, right? So if you're a one-person operation, don't have branch office locations, you're a solopreneur, you're not going to have a robust cybersecurity assessment done to your firm because you're just a solopreneur. You can monitor a lot of the things that you're doing. You can cover a lot of your basis on some of the stuff that the systems that you're using with multi-factor authentication, blah blah blah. But then you've got a larger firm that has hundreds of reps that they would look at. Okay, you do have to have like a cybersecurity assessment done. You do have to test these remote locations. You have to do all these things because you have more risk of potentially getting a data breach or some issues with all these multiple things. So with that being said, the regulators typically kind of key in on, okay, we look at this, they look at the size of your business model and stuff like that, and then they impose what they think is reasonable. That's always the reasonable, quote unquote, what is reasonable for this firm to do. I always tell most of my clients, if you're doing your best to try to be compliant, they're not going to like go after you. If you're legitimately making an honest to God effort, trying to be compliant and trying to, interpret the guidance that the rules and whatnot that they give you, and you're doing your best, you're doing the best effort. That's all they really ask for, right? Now, if you're someone that just says, I don't care about compliance, I'm not going to do this, blah, 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 and stuff like that, and you're not trying your best to be compliant, then they have issues. But most everyone that I work with, they all try to do a reasonable effort of being compliant to what with the resources they have. And that's all you can really ask for.
And that's your perspective as a former regulator,
yeah.
right? So,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so then I guess the question, do you think it could depend on the regulator you get on that day?
Yeah,
in terms of how to interpret this?
It definitely could. I've seen there is always going to be some kind of bias. There's going to be some kind of, depending on the examiner you're working with, you could have one that understands that, hey, you're an advisor, you're just trying to make a living, you're doing your best that you can with what you got. I understand that, and here's some things that you need to clean up, right? Or you could get one that just says, hey, be a hard butt or whatever, and enforce or try to enforce their will on you and stuff like that. So it really depends on the kind of examiner you get and what mindset they have too. That's how it works sometimes.
So to summarize what I'm hearing, Ivan, just to make sure that our advisors really get this, it's not as if there are different security and compliance standards for little firms and big firms, but what you're expected to do to prove that you're meeting those standards and what you're expected to have in place in terms of process is, for most regulators, right-sized to the size and scale of the firm that they're talking about.
Exactly. Yes.
And there seems to be some, there's some rationale there. Like, number one, you might not have the means to do all the complex due diligence, as you said, if you're a small solopreneur, but you're also not likely on the cybersecurity side a hard target as maybe, and there's not as many moving pieces as a firm that has 100 reps as you're talking about, right? If you have 100 reps, you can assume that somebody is trying to get in and attack you. Whereas it's like you're a solopreneur working out of your house. Yeah, maybe you should probably make sure your Wi-Fi is password protected, you know what I mean? And those types of things. But you're not likely going to have some brute force, somebody's going to try to get in the back door or whatever. And you don't have people, as many reps taking their laptops around the country or whatever. But that does kind of beg the question, like when you work with RIAs, do you have some lists of what is reasonable or what they should consider reasonable to do for their business to make sure that they are compliant with due diligence of the solutions they're using and cybersecurity type things? Like, do you say, hey, I don't know, like, make sure your Wi-Fi is password protected, make sure you use a VPN when traveling? Like, do you offer some sort of list like that you recommend to clients, to RIAs?
Yeah. I mean, we when we talk to clients all the time, when we talk to them about their operations and stuff, we always emphasize, if any system or mission critical system or any system that you're utilizing that has client sensitive information, make sure it's password protected. The strictest password settings you can possibly have multi-factor authentication wherever possible. In some cases, encrypt your hard drive or your computer. It's pretty easy now. You can just turn a switch on Microsoft and utilize BitCrypt or BitLocker to encrypt your hard drive on your laptop or your desktop or whatnot. There's little things you can do here and there to help strengthen your firm from, in this case, cybersecurity issues and whatnot. And that's the main issue with this due diligence process, right? With vendors, is because, outside vendors have access to your stuff that you've given them, and you want to make sure that they're taking the right protocol to make sure that, the information that they have access to is not being breached and stuff like that. So I understand where they're coming with this due diligence proposal for outsourced vendors. But yeah, there's a laundry list of things that, vendors can do or advisors can do to protect themselves from any breaches and stuff like that. But ultimately, like I said, it boils down to like how big the firm is, right? So, I mean, you can, at the bare minimum, you got to do that, right? But then if you've got other things where you're giving them remote access, and then things are on the cloud, and you're using their own computers, they're not issued company computers and all this, it gets a little bit convoluted and stuff like that. So then that's when issues can lie. There can be issues, right?
And I would think we're at a particularly vulnerable time, I guess, is, you just mentioned the LastPass thing, but we've come out of the pandemic year. And during the pandemic, many advisors dramatically changed their digital game and upped their digital game out of necessity, right? They suddenly started using cloud services. They suddenly started using a lot more email, text, and video stream type of stuff. So I would imagine, especially, I don't want to sound ageist here, but for some of your older, less tech savvy advisors, or as a overall population, we're probably accurate in saying that, they might have upped their risk level without even really thinking about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, yeah, ultimately, there's a lot of other things to think about now with digital communication. It's crazy. You see stuff out there now, like the things that boggle my mind is like now they're doing like deep fake things where they can mimic your voice. And so like hackers are getting so sophisticated now that, and I can give an example. I'm not trying to, this is one of the things I think came up in some conversation with one of my compliance consultants, that there was there's that instant, the example where someone hacks someone's email, sends an email saying, I need $50,000 to wire to Cambodia. And then you call and you try to verify if that's right. Well, now it's so sophisticated now that hackers are getting to the point where they can get a sample of your voice and then mimic your voice and then sound like you when you're talking to your advisor and potentially help aid that fraud, that process, right? So, I mean, nowadays you have to be very, very diligent. In some cases, that you've got to be almost triple check yourself in certain cases sometimes when this stuff comes about.
That's interesting because there are ways to validate somebody is who they say they are, but the process, particularly at the firm who might authorize that transfer, has to be really spot on, and they have to be very diligent, right? Humans are the most hacked part of the system, right?
Exactly.
And you hear about that kind of a hack all the time. It's called social engineering. It's been around for a long time. And there's some things advisors can do in their practice to prevent that, but their partners also have to do a good job. As a for instance, if somebody makes a request like that, then you should be calling numbers that are on file. And,
exactly.
Getting the person through an independent channel to validate that they then have a control of that device that about. It's called out of band validation. So sorry, folks, if this sounds geeky, and I used to work in security. That was one of the startups that I've been involved in. So there are a lot of ways and approaches here to deal with this, but humans are always the vulnerable part of the system.
That's an incredibly good recommendation, John. That, we always love to have some actionable tips that come out of these podcasts. And I like that one. The fact that if you're an advisor, if you need to confirm a trade or a transfer of any kind, any money movement, make sure you are calling a known number. Because you might not be able to rely on email 100%, right? So you want to confirm, like, hey, just confirming I'm about to send that wire. With a phone call, you emailed me something, and if they're like, what are you talking about? I didn't even, because people's emails get exposed all the time. How many times you get an email saying it's so-and-so, and you're like, you look at the actual email address, that's not them. That's called phishing, right? Is that like he's going to pretend?
I mean, and it's amazing that, the technology nowadays, people can mimic your voice, but, to mimic your face, it's a little bit harder. So now you can do FaceTime or video conferencing and get them on the video conference and do that, and then just verify, okay, this is John. I'm talking to John directly. So that's another way to prevent that as well. But yeah, I mean, that's going to probably, I see potentially becoming an issue down the road too. But not the video conferencing, but people mimicking voices and stuff like that to access stuff. So
yeah, my goodness. Well, shifting gears back to the proposed rule change. Let's start talking about maybe what brought this on, right? So one of the things that John posited during our prep call was that this proposed rule change may have some political motivation behind it, and I'll let him talk to that a little more. But we have seen a wave of new fintech innovation in recent years, right? In the last decade, it's just been this explosion of new solutions, and people on the retail level and at the institutional level are really racing to embrace a lot of new tech that's making life easier and in some cases making it a lot more affordable. And it's pretty easy to assume that's put a bit of a scare into established players, right? Your big box wealth management firm. So I'll avoid the notion of any malicious intent that they're trying to tamp down things, but that might be in the back of my brain. But let's take that off the table for a second, and assume that the industry, the regulators are nervous about the potential impact that these new solution providers may have on their business, but also on the consumer, right? The financial consumer. It might be like, hey, we got to protect them too. We also have to protect our business. And the foundation of the business is trust, right? So we have to make sure that everything's trustworthy. So let's, maybe that's the process we come here. Ivan, as we mentioned earlier, you were a regulator and you now provide compliance services to RIAs. Take us behind the scenes, maybe from that unique perspective of how does this process work? How does the SEC start looking at certain things that they may want to change the rules, and how does it get rolled out?
I mean, it's, they typically, something comes about. And here's, I hate to say it. Most of the time things get proposed, it's reactive. It's always reactive. It's never proactive. Something big happens and then something has to be done. So, I mean, the best example I can give, the most recent example I can give is the collapse of FTX. People lost their money. People that had money in FTX's exchange, you got frozen out. They lost their life savings, blah, blah, blah. And then they reacted. This cryptocurrency, issues with cryptocurrency, I'm not trying to be a critique of, the SEC or anything like that, but the issues with cryptocurrencies, it's been an issue for, several years now. The scam artists, the pump and dump schemes and stuff like that, it was the Wild West. I mean, it literally was the Wild West. And then it takes something as big as this to finally get some traction on, okay, we got to regulate this thing, right? So I hate to say it, is most proposed rules stem from some kind of issue that has happened that they needed to act, right? So, I'm guessing that one of the vendor rule probably happened because they are starting to see a lot of vendors that, Redtail, for example, they got hacked a few years back. A lot of financial advisors were using their systems. A lot of client data information was being stored there. So, stuff like that, it probably triggered, hey, we need to figure out a way to bone up on the due diligence process for these outside vendors. So unfortunately, it's not something that comes out of okay, what do we need to tackle? It's always something's happened that, hey, we need to do something about this. And unfortunately, that's the way it goes. I wish they were more proactive in some cases, but it's never like that. It's always reactive. Which, I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. I wish it wasn't like that, but that's how it works typically.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember here, though, that, we're talking about a lot of technology and technology vendors. And, I'm a technology vendor, so that's my perspective. And we're all tech savvy people. But this isn't about technology outsourcing. It's about all outsourcing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's about outsourcing to a virtual assistant. It's about outsourcing your asset management, and what is that small niche asset manager or small niche TAMP doing around, the data and making sure that it's all up to snuff. So it's a much broader thing than just technology vendors. I think that's critical to understand. And there's a lot of pieces of this that are covering vendors where the SEC doesn't necessarily have direct authority, right? So it, and our audience may not be fully aware of that, but the SEC doesn't have jurisdiction over the operations of a software company like Blue Leaf. It doesn't have jurisdiction over the operations of an outsourcing, virtual assistant company, somebody that does all of this. And so the only lever the SEC has to control those operations is to ensure through the advisory firms, the custodians, et cetera, that those things are doing the right things by clients, is to do it through the compliance process. It is a way to grant regulatory oversight beyond the SEC's purview, right, Ivan?
It always falls on the advisor. I mean, the buck stops with them because they're the ones that are using the vendor. So it's on them to make sure the vendor that they're using is there's no issues with, how they're accessing clients' sensitive information and stuff like that. So yeah, through an indirect arm, they're looking at your business model, like Blue Leaf and us as a compliance consultant. But it falls on the advisor for selecting that vendor and making sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and not doing what they're not supposed to be doing with the client information. It's always going to fall on the advisor. I mean, but indirectly, it's we're helping the advisor, so we're part of that process. But ultimately, if something goes wrong, it's on the advisor's head, not on us necessarily.
That's interesting. It's funny that we talk about whose responsibility is it? And I had this one idea that popped into my mind for this. It's like what can only be called a reverse hold harmless agreement, right? So we've all had hold harmless agreements like, hey, you're going to come in here, and if you get hurt, it's not our fault if you're on this ice rink skating around, you fall down and break your arm. That's on you. You're holding us harmless from your own slip and fall situation. That's a one that we've probably all signed at one point in time, something very similar to that. But as I think about, as and John's biggest challenge with this, and I think rightfully so, is shifting so much burden on a relatively small entity to be able to do due diligence that they have no basis, reasonable ability to actually do it. Like they don't understand, encryption and all the other things that go on behind the scenes, one type of encryption versus another. It just seems overly burdensome. One way a vendor could offer relief from that angst is say, hey, you will be held harmless should the SEC come knocking on our door. Or the advisor could use a firm like yours, RIA Compliance Concepts, and have you draft up this is an appendix to our contract here. We're not going to be held harmless. Should you fail XYZ Co. To live up to the standard that I reasonably think you're doing, that's going to be on you. The SEC, any fines that arise are going to be on your head, not my head.
It's an idea. Well, so I understand if the economics were split in such a way that was possible, it would work. The challenge is, software is a tiny fraction of the spend for a given advisor and a tiny fraction of the revenue from the asset management, work that gets done. And so in some sense, there's not enough software revenue dollars to do that. Like it's so you got to shift liability where the business value goes, because that's who benefits. And so it'll be tough. And it's also, the alternative is you think vendors are expensive now. Like, that would essentially just be adding on the price of a much more expensive insurance policy into the vendor's cost. Now, any vendor worth their salt is going to have, liability insurance and business continuity and, insurance, errors and omissions, particularly anybody who's doing anything to do with trading. So you're going to cover those things. But you're not going to have enough money to cover punitive fines and these other kinds of things that arise. So you'd have to get more insurance coverage, and then those costs gets passed along, which that's possible. It's possible.
So I want to just kind of, not tooting my own horn or anything, but whenever I work with a prospective client, I already beat most of my clients to the due diligence process. I give them, as part of our I give them our proposal. I give them a copy of our business continuity plan, internal business continuity plan. I give them a copy of our internal cybersecurity policies and procedures. I give them copies of our binder information, E&O and cyber liability binder information. And so that's like, it's the start of our engagement. I'm giving you everything that you typically want in your due diligence file on a vendor. You know what I mean? Except for like internal, a cybersecurity assessment, which I haven't, it's still pending. We're working on that right now. But ultimately, those are the things I've already, here's the things that I'm making your life easier on us as a vendor that potentially would have access to client sensitive information. I'm giving you everything that you need for your file, right? But ultimately, it's still, you still got to do stuff like you got to look and see, type in RI compliance concepts, data breach and stuff like that, and do searches and see if there's anything like that or financial issues or whatever. But ultimately, any advisor that I talk to, any vendor that they use, I always tell them, create a file for that vendor, get as much information as you possibly can about that vendor, and then, start, making sure you have all that information and create an informal due diligence file on them. So you have that for your records, because eventually at some point people are going to start asking for that.
And a lot of vendors provide sort of, once you're in their software, they provide access to a library of those documents. I mean, we have several hundred pages of those documents that get updated every year. And so, people have access in that way, even if they don't really have an ability to assess what's in front of them.
Yeah.
They have it, and then they'd have to pay somebody like you, Ivan, to read through it and sort of interpret it.
Yeah.
But also, you mentioned, let's do a search on, compliance consultants and data breach. It's interesting. You also brought up Redtail and their data breach 4 or 5 years ago when it happened. I'm not so sure that is the mark of somebody who's managing poorly. I'd say that there's a lot more data breaches that probably go unreported. And I think, we've assessed our own partners and I know Brian at Redtail, and, we do our own diligence on our partners, and I think it's just an arms race. And, at points in time, somebody will get unlucky. And I think, some process somewhere, across hundreds of people had a hole in it, and the timing was such that it got exploited. And, we're all in this kind of arms race. And I think that's the unique thing about tech vendors and the larger asset managers, right? You have a target on your back.
Yeah.
Most tech vendors have thousands of breach attempts every single day. I'm not saying that to alarm anyone, but believe me, we've all had to erect very high walls that are very thick with multiple layers of defenses in order to just stay in business. Like it's just the price of staying in business for most technology vendors in the space.
One question that I imagine is on the minds of advisors that are listening to us, and I don't think we've sound alarmist. We've sound very like, hey, this could be a challenge here. Like, what are you responsible for, advisor, when it comes to this type of stuff? And what might such a change mean for you? Is it going to increase your work, increase your expenses and so forth, or increase the complexity of your business? One question that always comes to my mind as I think about regulation is, what is the penalty? Right? Like, so let's just say somebody had a reasonable, failed the reasonable person test on something like this. Like, hey, dude, you really should have a password on your Wi-Fi. Your computer should have a password on it too. Like you're working out of coffee shops here. It's not a reasonable person who should know you might be getting hacked and exposing personal identifiable information on your clients and so forth. Let's just say a regulator discovers that. What is the potential punishment, if you will, or slap on the wrist? What does that look like for an advisor?
I mean, it depends on the severity of it, right? I mean,
yeah.
Typically, if it's something like that, where it's like, oh, you're exposing your stuff at the coffee shop and blah blah blah, and they do their they go through the interview process and they learn that you're not using a VPN and you're using public Wi-Fi and all that stuff. They're probably going to give you a stern talking to and more of like a slap on the wrist for something like that. But if it's something like major where, hey, you're a big firm and you ignored multi-factor authentication, you're doing all these things that you're not supposed to be doing, and something like that, and it's a high risk type of thing, and you've got all these processes and procedures and all of these fail safe, and there's still people doing something wrong, then yeah, you're probably going to get hit with some kind of fine or an order or something like that. And then more than likely, it's just going to be like a written reprimand. It won't probably be like a fine. But if a fine, you typically see fines when someone's like doing something really egregious. They're not living up to their expectations on what they should be doing, and there's material harm that's being caused by the client. So if there was like, you didn't do these things and there was a data breach, and you knew that you were doing these things and it caused that kind of security risk, then yeah, you're going to get fined, like big time.
Yeah. I always think that's an important thing to bring up, because I think a lot of people get nervous about using certain solutions or whatever, because they're not only afraid of the workload, but like, oh, if I do that, like back in the early days of social media usage for financial advisors, many advisors were petrified. It's like, listen, you're probably not going to get fined unless you're really trying to defraud people. I mean, that's the SEC is out to protect investors, right? That's what they're looking to do. Like they want you to take some reasonable precautions to do it. So unless you're like a fraudster, you're probably not going to get fined or majorly sanctioned. To your point, you might get a stern talking to, like, hey, dude, come on.
Yeah.
Have a password on you.
Yeah.
Well, and it does feel like this is, again, this issue of the scale of the firm dictates the scale of their response.
Yes.
Yeah.
A lot of the feedback that we've got is at the state level and the smaller end of the SEC regulator level. It is, a written note, and it's essentially you got to remedy this, and you need to do it in 60 days, 90 days, whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's a call to remedy, which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But for big firms, I've heard the reverse. So we have some very large customers, and the largest customers have reported, and this is with the SEC, and this is only anecdotal SEC, so I'm only talking about the people I've heard from. But the regulators tend to be motivated to find 2 or 3 things that they can sort of make an example out of with the larger firms as a way to sort of push them to sort of improve. It's a funny sort of stick-based way to try and get the larger firms to improve, even if these things aren't particularly material. You see cases where those firms weren't doing anything particularly egregious, but they got fined anyway because, well, we did the audit, we had to find something, and well, we gotta pay for the auditors somehow. So I've heard that. I'm curious if you can comment on that, if you've heard anything like that among your larger customers, Ivan.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard rumblings of that from some clients, not my clients, but like clients that have relationships with other larger firms and stuff like that. So I've seen stuff like that. I've seen that a ton of times with firms that are registered with FINRA, obviously. But
that's a whole different animal. People.
That's a whole different animal anyway. But long and short of it, yeah. I mean, there are some, larger firms that, there's a higher expectation that they should be doing taking these extra steps for being a large firm, and, something fell through the cracks and they had to cite you for it because you should have known better, kind of thing. Because you've got all these risks, and that you got all these risks, you should do something, right? So. As simple as you can basically say it.
Beyond the new rule on outsourcing or proposed rule on outsourcing, there's been some rule changes, or it might be still in the proposal stage, for rules on cybersecurity risk management. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about that. We have touched on that a bit here. Are there any new things that RIAs should be on the look for from that rule? And what are you and your team doing in terms of the way that you advise?
As far as for cybersecurity, I always tell them to, like the bigger, like the SEC firms, they need to start gearing up and getting an IT vendor in tow and start researching a vendor, because ultimately it's going to come down to like they're going to start requiring cybersecurity assessments done every year for SEC firms. From the state level, that's not something that's been proposed yet. I guess because they recognize that the cost of those types of assessments are outside the scope of or cost of doing business for smaller firms that are state registered. So that hasn't been proposed yet at the state level, but the SEC firms, they see that those firms can afford potentially cybersecurity assessments, especially one-man operations, stuff like that. So that's something that I'm starting to advise most clients. Hey, you're going to start wanting to look at IT vendors to help you with that, because it's inevitability that's going to happen. So,
and Ivan, what's a typical cost range that you've seen for those kind of cybersecurity assessments?
I've seen them as cheap as $3,000, and I've seen them as expensive as $50,000. And then when we're talking about $50,000, it's for like a big firm that has like multiple offices, multiple, hundreds of reps, stuff like that. So those are for the larger firms, but I've seen them as high as 50 and as low as $3,000. It's $3,000. So, and it's basically like a penetration, an adverse assessment. So from a hacker's perspective, they're like trying to find penetration testing and stuff like that is what they're looking for. So,
sure, which is something that's really familiar to those of us in the technology world. I mean, we get those things done several times a year, and there's a variety of things that you do there. But that's a totally new concept to most
advisors
firms that are not technology firms, and most advisory firms. It's sort of white hat or friendly hacking is the idea there, but it goes beyond that. It's a real assessment of all their processes and the like, and documentation of all of that.
Yeah, and the training aspect is the crucial part, right? Like you said earlier in the podcast, you said that the human factor is a big part of it, and so having your people educated and understand, the various ways that you can be infiltrated and different ways that you can protect yourself and stuff like that, the different malware, viruses, schemes, all of that stuff, that being knowledgeable of that. And then also, on the flip side, it's also the advisors starting to inform their client base of these things, because you're getting, advisors get, spoof emails or phishing emails from client emails, right? And the client's been hacked and they're requesting, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of, education. The big part is like the education factor of informing advisors, or advisors learning more about this stuff on their end, and then informing their client base as well.
That's a wonderful way to like build relationships with those clients even more deeply, right? Like, I've heard many advisors do something like that. Like, hey, I want to invite you in to talk about cybersecurity. This may not be something that's on top of your mind, but it's on top of our mind, and you have a vital role to play in the cybersecurity of our firm, because we communicate with you, and some of our stuff is on your computers and in your home, right? Let's talk about these types of things, and people will appreciate that. I mean, heck, if I have to see one more of my aunts claim that she was hacked on Facebook, but she's not, she's being fit now. But you know what I'm saying? Like, many of them, this is not a thought that's running through their heads about how careful they need to be with what they click on, where they enter personally identifiable information, whether they're, on an open Wi-Fi or whatever. I think clients would really appreciate that type of conversation.
And we certainly see requests on the increase from our customers to help them learn about cybersecurity and general security process.
Yeah.
we already do a lot of tech stack building consulting as part of our business. Just, when you've got hundreds of years of experience, collectively building technology stacks that work well and that are super secure and the like, we definitely become a place that folks have turned to. But we're actually talking about creating some educational material to teach people about these areas in response to this cybersecurity rule that's coming out. Because, to your point earlier, Ivan, a lot of this is education related, and you need to get education from real experts. And we figure, given that we live this every day, we fit the definition of real experts in cybersecurity. I mean, my co-founder's a PhD in cryptography from Harvard, so it's in our
Show
DNA.
off.
Awesome.
Yep, I'm showing off, baby.
He's showing off. Him too. It's like he's showing off.
But along those lines, we also get some feedback that we've been pretty helpful to our customers in the audit process in terms of how the advisors have performed in audits. And it's been across a range of things, right? Whether it's because of the open, engaging platform we've got for clients and how informed clients are and how transparent that process is. The regulators have given really strong feedback that they like that, or whether it's the available reporting that they can pull that's really easy to sort of provide regulators documentation, or whether it's some of the training that we do that is sort of part of the training package that they show to regulators. So Ivan, I'm curious, what do you think technology and technology vendors can do to help advisors stay compliant, either with the compliance process itself or in terms of how they manage their staff internally and how they manage client relationships?
I mean, ultimately, like I said, what we typically tell our client, or we offer cybersecurity training at a point where we break out, just the simplest terms. Because I mean, let's be honest, like techno terminology is a scary thing, right? And so we have to break it down to the basic level, like what is malware, what's a Trojan horse, what are these terminologies that you need to be aware of. You need to. And then describe how a firm can get infiltrated and whatever. So we go through a detailed process of basic terms. I mean, we're not cybersecurity experts, but we give them the basic knowledge that they need to know, and identifying phishing emails. What simple things that they can use on a daily basis. Now, are there other sophisticated things that can be done from a cybersecurity perspective? Yes, absolutely. But most of those are not being used by general consumer. It's just a typical phishing email. It's a ransomware kind of situation, stuff like that. But ultimately, yeah, when we refer, most of the time it's just educational stuff. But if it gets to the point where a client is coming to us and say, hey, I think we're having an issue with phishing and it's something like that, and then I point them, hey, you need to talk to IT vendor and have them do an assessment on you. So you cover your bases, and then check your cyber liability insurance and see what that covers you and stuff like that. So there's a little bit of a progression in there. Now, it's for if their client gets hacked, then we tell them, okay, here's the basic things that you want to do. You want to inform the custodian that they've been hacked. You want to tell the client to pretty much get a new email. Yeah, that's basic standard nowadays. Just get a new email. Inform your relatives, hey, if you're getting an email requesting money or something like that from me, it's not me. And then take those safety precautions and stuff like that. But if it depends on the seriousness of the issue. So if a firm feels like they're getting hacked, then they need to go to an IT professional and point them in the right direction on that. But if it's simple stuff that a client's got a spoof email that requested money from the firm, and the client told them that it was a phishing email, then we tell them, hey, here's some of the steps you need to do to protect the client, and tell the client that they need to do this.
Fantastic advice. Well, this has been very, very informative. I can't believe how much new stuff I got in my brain on this. But I assume some of the advisors who listen to us are going to want to follow up and learn more. And I'm hoping you get some new clients out of this. I mean, who wouldn't want to work with RIA compliance concepts after this? So the website, and we'll get this link. The website is RIACC, as in complianceconcepts.io. And while you're there, make sure you subscribe to Ivan's podcast. Ivan's got the RIA Compliance Collective podcast, which is awesome. I've actually been a guest, so if you want to search me out, you'll find me there. I'll be more of Mike Langford.
Show off.
Ivan, is there anything else that you and the team there are up to that you want to make sure the world knows about before we let you go?
Yeah, annual amendment deadline to file your annual ADV amendment is March 31st. If you need assistance, give us a call.
Fantastic. I love it. I wish the phone call is linked up too. Well, this has been great. Thank you very much, Ivan. We really appreciate you coming on the show.
Hey, no problem. Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you very much for listening to and or watching this episode of the Augmented Advisor podcast. It was fantastic to have you with us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did, right? It was a blast, honestly. Really good stuff. And I kind of make light of it, this whole conversation about compliance, but dude, it's important. It's kind of what sets our industry apart from other industries, right? It's not the Wild West. People put their trust in you, and regulations compliance kind of make that all work. So anyways, huge thanks to Ivan Barretto from RIA Compliance Concepts for joining us. Make sure you check out the RIA Compliance Collective podcast. Ivan and the team do a fantastic job, as you heard me say. I've been on the podcast a couple of times, and John's going to be going on the podcast in the not too distant future. So make sure you subscribe and don't miss John on the pod, okay? Now, as I mentioned at the top of the show, please do make sure you subscribe to this podcast if you haven't done so already. We're on all your favorite platforms. And do us a favor, make sure you give the Blue Leaf page a follow on LinkedIn, follow the Twitter feed, and while you're at it, following all this stuff, click subscribe on YouTube. We're getting really active on YouTube, and I love to see that subscriber count grow and see more engagement there. And you get to see our handsome faces on your screen. It's amazing stuff. So please do click that subscribe button on YouTube. Okay? That's all I have for you today. Hope you're having a good day. Be safe and be nice to each other. We'll see you next time on the Augmented Advisor podcast. See ya. Bye.